And what Jesus says is, that temple is me.
Right.
I am the representative of God's covenant.
Right.
You come to me, my crucified body and resurrected body. That's who you come to. That's the symbol of the repaired relationship with God. I am the symbol of God's covenant blessing for all the world. I am its new king.
Welcome to the Spoken Gospel Podcast. Spoken Gospel is a ministry that's dedicated to speaking the gospel out of every corner of Scripture. In Luke 24, Jesus told his disciples that every part of the Bible was about him. So each week, hosts David and Seth work through a passage of Scripture to see how it's all about Jesus and his good news. Let's jump in.
Well, welcome everyone to the Spoken Gospel Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. We are continuing in the book of Haggai today, and we'll wrap it up.
That's right.
We looked at 3 of the 5 oracles in Haggai last week, looking at God's presence providing for his people. And this week we're looking at the other 2 oracles, talking about leadership and the shaking of the nations.
That's right.
So how you feeling today, Seth?
I mean, I'm feeling...
You ready? You like a world shaker?
I'm going to be a world shaker today. shake up the nations. With my leadership.
That's right. This podcast took a turn.
Yeah.
We're a leadership podcast now.
Tom Collins? What is his name?
Who?
John Collins? No.
From Bible Project?
No, the Tony Robbins.
Tony Robbins and John Collins. That is hilarious. Tony Robbins.
That's where we're headed.
Do you know I once performed
I think
on
I did
stage
know
with
that.
Tony Robbins?
I think that's the only reason I know the name
Yep.
Tony Robbins is because you were on stage with Tony Robbins.
That was an experience.
I'm sure it was.
Never again.
That's exactly what we're talking about today.
World shaken. Okay. So get us back up, it's been a week. Get me back up to speed with Haggai, the temple, everything like that. Where are we in time? What's on the line?
So last week, we kind of retold the whole history of God's people around the temple and what the temple represented.
Right.
So I'm kind of interested in actually retelling the whole history of God's people, but from the perspective of the leaders of God's people.
Okay.
Because I think that would be helpful as we go into what Haggai wants to say in the second point.
Love it.
So let's start in the garden this time.
Okay.
Like all the way back.
Yes. We started in Exodus and then went to the garden last
right.
time. Yep.
God has a plan for a people,
Mm-hmm.
his people, his humanity as a category.
Right.
And that begins by deputizing 2 leaders, Adam and Eve.
Yes.
A
king and a queen.
King and a queen who are meant to obey God's laws.
Uh-huh.
And through their leadership, their entire generation, their entire genealogy will experience the life and abundance of God.
Yep.
Right?
They're going to be fruitful and multiply, and their little princes and princesses will have dominion over the world.
Right.
And bring abundance to all of creation.
But when the leaders of God fail, they are removed from the experience of that life and blessing.
Mm-hmm.
However, God still promises that a future leader will come and undo the destruction caused by the serpent, the other counter leader, right?
So what you're saying is, I've never thought of it this way. We're saying if you view Adam and Eve as 2 leaders, and they're about to have all these children, then their corporate failure as leaders ended up cursing their children that weren't yet born, but they would have been in the garden. But the leader failure of Adam and Eve led to a kingdom-wide, family-wide, deportation or exile.
Yeah,
for
like
all their
humanity
kids,
as a category has now been no longer allowed to experience the life-giving presence of God.
Yeah.
Because of the failure of its leadership.
Okay. Yeah.
But there will be a leader who comes.
Okay, but you mentioned something else too.
Yeah.
About Satan as a other leader, the snake as the
yeah.
leader.
So we are introduced to this character of the serpent in the garden who offers another form of wisdom, another way to rule themselves and to rule in the world.
Different way of leadership.
A different way of leadership.
One, I guess, not under the ultimate leadership of God.
Right. That's right.
Be your own leader.
Be your own leader.
Okay.
And so he tempts them with that, and they choose that, and he
ends up becoming their slave master.
That's right. He becomes the leader of those who refuse to be led by God.
Ooh, that's good. Stitch that on a
pillow.
pillow.
That's a
Satan is the leader of those refusing to be led by God. What an interesting pillow Grandma has on her couch. Okay, but you said there's another leader coming.
Eve is promised that one of her sons would crush the one who has been cursed by God. And that leader will bring back God's people into his presence one day.
We need a new leader.
We need a new leader.
Okay.
And so the history of Israel goes on, and we're introduced
to a lot of new leaders.
To a whole bunch of new leaders. Abraham and Moses is a pretty interesting one here. He starts he's not just a leader of a people or a leader of a category. He becomes the first king of a people, a nation. He's the king of Israel, the governor of Israel, the leader of a nation constituted by God in a covenant relationship with God, a national treaty with God. God promises to be their provider, to give them safety, protection from enemies, to not just protect them in battle, but to provide for their land, provided that Moses, as a leader, continues to lead his people to follow God and his commands and the commands of his covenant.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
But the leaders of God's people, Aaron and Moses, both fail those commands in one way or another.
Yeah.
God's people are lost in the wilderness as a result of their failure of leadership until a new generations of leader pop up. Joshua, and he's really important for this one.
Okay.
Because we have another man named Joshua.
Right, the priest.
The high priest named Joshua. Joshua is told to be strong, to be courageous, to not fear. God will provide peace for them, for all of God's people, through his leadership.
Yeah.
If he's strong, if he's courageous, if he goes to battle, lets God fights on his behalf, God will give him the nation again, right?
Yes.
However,
they get the land, then there's some kings or judges first.
Judges first. Their failure of leadership leads to increasing chaos. The kings come, increasing chaos. But also, interesting fact, David and Solomon are both kind of the idea or the category of the leaders of God's people being pictures of what will happen to the rest of God's people is set up really clearly. When David fails with Bathsheba, the whole kingdom falls apart.
Right.
And then Solomon, when he takes the throne, is told very, very explicitly that if you follow my commands, Solomon, the kingdom will be blessed.
Yes.
So there's this reinforcement of the fact that the leadership of God's people determines the fate of the nation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that project with the kings doesn't go quite so well.
No. It doesn't. It went wrong about 70 different ways.
70 different ways. I see what you did there. Until Jeconiah, the last king of Israel.
Okay.
The grandfather of Zerubbabel.
Okay.
And one of the last things we're told about Jeconiah, or not the last thing, but an interesting thing we are told about Jeconiah is found in the book of Isaiah. And God removes Jeconiah like a signet ring or a sealing ring.
Okay.
And a signet ring is a symbol of authority. That's what kings would stamp decrees with. That was their
you would go and kiss their ring as a symbol of fealty.
Right. It's a symbol of their royal authority.
Yeah.
So the history of God's people before the Babylonian exile is one of increasingly failed leadership until God says, fine, I will take responsibility of following the covenant away from my people. I remove the signet ring. No longer is royal authority invested in these people. No longer will the leader be able to bring my covenant blessing. No longer will my leader be able to bring back the blessing that was once in the garden.
Whoa.
That's what happens when God's removing royal authority from the Davidic line in the exile.
Okay, so the question then becomes, who then is able to lead the people of God back into a covenant relationship with him?
That's exactly right.
Last episode we talked where was the temple, but now who becomes the issue?
In the temple episode, we talked about how the temple is where the relationship with God could be repaired. That's where the covenant was repaired. You offered a sacrifice, covenant was repaired. Similarly, a king was how the covenant was enacted. Without a king, you can't have a covenant. Covenants were made between two kings.
I see. Yahweh the king and Israel's king.
Yes, Moses or Joshua or David or whoever it is. Covenants are made between kings. That would have probably been helpful to say up front. But that's
helpful. That's
the idea. Covenants are made between kings. So if you don't have a king, royal authority is divested from anybody in Israel's family line.
That's super helpful because I was going to ask the question, what's the fixation on leadership?
Yeah.
I think especially for a Western individualist.
Right.
I'm like, how dare you seal my fate with some loser president or something?
Yeah, but citizens don't make treaties with
kings. Foreign kings.
That's right. Only kings make treaties with kings.
That's
so
right.
God the King entered a treaty with the king of Israel, Moses.
Right.
And from that time on, or Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve.
Like, that's the way it's always been.
Yep, that's the way it's always been.
So if royal authority has been divested of any human, how can God make a treaty with his people? How can God make a covenant with his people again?
So Israel has no king, therefore it can have no covenant.
Right. It has no temple, therefore it can have no place to repair the covenant or for God's place to dwell. So...
Okay. I get what's on the line.
You get what's on the line.
Yes. In Haggai's day, there's no king to facilitate a new covenant between God and his people.
That's
to
right.
renegotiate the terms of the covenant.
Right.
And so who is going to lead that new treaty ceremony between Israel and her God?
That's right.
Okay.
So which is why it's really fascinating that Haggai opens up with a man named Joshua, one of Israel's old kings, the one that was really instrumental in establishing Israel in its own land for the first time.
The successor of Moses.
A successor of Moses.
Yeah.
And Zerubbabel, the grandson of the last king of Israel. And, importantly, a descendant of King David.
Right.
God promised that he would never forsake David's covenant.
Right.
He would always have a son on the throne of Israel. So perhaps, if God's people return to the land, if the temple's rebuilt, this new Joshua and this new David, maybe God would reinstate his covenant once again. We have all the pieces to make it happen.
That's right. But what does God think about that? You know?
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to hear, what's Haggai going to say that God's thinking about all these pieces being in place?
And I guess that's where we jump into the book of Haggai.
Okay, so all the pieces are in place. You've got two potential new leaders to facilitate the establishment of the covenant with God once again. You've got Joshua, the high priest. You've got Zerubbabel, the son of David. But, you know, that's at least their delegation is showing up. Of course, they're not necessarily leading the people the best way when Haggai hits the scene. We talked about their failure to rebuild the temple last time. I think the other side is now we need God's delegation to say God has a side of the treaty too. Right? Is he about to divest this authority to Joshua and
give
Zerubbabel?
It back to
yeah.
So
is he going to allow them to be the king?
Right.
Okay. So I mean, I'm also sorry. I'm also still thinking like he threw the ring away, right? Like he broke up with him.
Yeah.
Like where did he
broke up with him?
Did he keep the ring? Like
So
he threw his granddad's ring away. Is he going to give it back to Zerubbabel? These are questions I'm asking.
Well, and I think that tension is the tension you're supposed to feel when you read the Bible, right? It's like God said he would never forsake his people entirely. He would that he did it.
But then he chucked the ring.
Then so like what does that mean? How long is that supposed to last?
Right.
So 70 years after exile, here we are.
Okay.
As we said last time, Haggai has two buckets of prophecy. Bucket number one is this critique of the failure to rebuild the temple, and the promise of God's Spirit and God's presence.
Yeah, and oracles 1, 2, and 4 went in that bucket.
Yes, but oracles 3 and 5 go in bucket number 2, which is this hope of a returning leader. And so we'll talk about those.
Okay, let's do it. So do we start in Oracle 3?
We start in Oracle 3 in chapter 2.
Okay.
In the 7th month, on the 21st day of the month, so a little over a month later after he first arrives on the scene.
Okay, so how long has the temple project been going on at this point?
I mean, it started on the 21st day. The 24th day of the month in the 6th month, and this is the 21st day of the 7th month.
It's like a month.
So a little under a month later, here's what Haggai says to Zerubbabel and to Joshua. Who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it not as nothing in your eyes? So remember how he asked these rhetorical questions to everybody else. He's kind of asking another set of rhetorical questions to the leaders of God's people. And he says, I want you leaders to ask these questions to the elders of your elders of our nation.
Yeah.
The ones who might have remembered the first one. And what are they going to say? This temple is as nothing.
Right.
You've started laying the groundwork, clearing the road to lay that first foundation stone, but you know that it's not going to be impressive as it was before.
Yeah.
We don't have the resources. The ground is in famine conditions, so we don't even have the wood to get here to make it as impressive. Like, we know it's not going to be as big of a deal. So should we keep going?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because everybody else watching, I mean, I remember like in Ezra, they see during this time after like Zerubbabel makes the first push on the temple.
Yep.
They look at it, and the old people who lived there and saw the old temple, they just cry.
That's right.
They're like, this temple sucks compared to the old one.
This isn't what it used to be. And I think in Zechariah it talks about this being a day of small things.
Right. I remember us talking about that.
It's like, oh, it's significant, but it's nothing like it was before.
Yeah.
So the question then is like, so how important is the opulence of the temple to the preservation of God's covenant?
Oh,
right?
That's a really good question. Right.
Yeah.
Does it matter? Legitimate question.
Right.
Does it matter that we build a house fit for the God of the universe?
Yeah.
Like, is the quality of the structure going to affect the quality of the presence of God?
Right. And I think even more narrowly, is the quality of the structure we are able to build dictate how present God will be with us to bless us.
I just don't have the resources.
I
can't really put together this great of a house.
Right.
Okay.
As a leader, it's really discouraging. I can't do any better than this.
It's the best thing I can do.
This is the best that I can do.
And I know it stinks.
And so here's what God says to Joshua. Be strong, O Joshua. Remember how God
told Joshua, the first Joshua, be strong and courageous.
That's right.
Yeah, for the Lord is with you.
Be strong, O Joshua. Be strong, all you people of the land. Work because I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts. He repeats the promise he made before. It's like, I know it's not as impressive, but the impressiveness doesn't matter.
The impressive thing is the God of the universe is with you.
I am with you according to the covenant I made with you when you came out of Egypt. I'm just as present now in this ramshackle temple as I was
in
all
that
the way
ramshackle
back then.
tent.
That's right.
Yeah,
Nothing has changed. My spirit remains in your midst. Fear not. Be strong and courageous.
Yeah.
Fear not. For thus says the Lord of hosts, yet once more, in a little while, I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land. So yet once more, I will shake the heavens and the earth. Mount Sinai was described as a shaking of the heavens and the earth.
Okay.
The mountain shook, remember? So it's like, yet once more, I will come and make a covenant with my people.
Oh, so he's saying, once more, I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth. And usually, if you take something and shake it, something's going to fall out.
That's right.
So I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth, and I'm going to fall out. Is that what he's saying?
Let's keep reading. So but just log in your mind.
In Sinai,
that's called a shaking.
When God came, it was a shaking.
That's called a shaking.
Okay.
And in that time, he provided treasure from Egypt. Right?
Yep.
Okay, so just
that.
keep it in mind. And I will shake all nations, so that the treasures of all nations will come in, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord of hosts. Silver is mine, gold is mine, and the latter glory of this house, the former glory of this house, will be...
no, the latter glory.
What
it's going to be in the future.
What it's going to be in the future will be greater than what was in the past.
Yep.
And in this place, I will give peace, which is also the promise of Joshua.
Oh, right.
Peace.
A land on peace. Peace on every side.
Peace on every side, declares the Lord of hosts.
Okay, so don't worry about how your day of small things, how ramshackled this place is going to be.
Joshua and Zerubbabel, don't worry about the insufficiency of your leadership to live up to what was before. On my own power, I will give everything that will make this place of my presence even more impressive than the last one.
I see. And he's going to do it by a shaking.
By a shaking. I will shake the nations.
And two things happen when he shakes the nation. One is that the nations bring their wealth to the temple, and the other thing is that his glory fills it. Okay, so shaking happens, the temple is beautified, and God fills that temple.
That's right.
Okay,
why
a shaking? What's going on here?
That's the way... As I said, that's the way God appears on Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
So when God appears somewhere, the earth shakes.
Yeah.
That's kind of like common language throughout Scripture to describe what the earth does when God comes near it.
I see.
Especially when he's coming near it to either judge evil or to do something significant on behalf of his people. The earth shook when he made a covenant with his people and made them his nation for the first time. The earth also shakes when he comes and destroys nations who oppose God's people as well.
So the shaking is the presence of God.
Yes. Yeah, it's the physical reaction of the world to the presence of God.
Okay. That's helpful because it's tying in what we talked about last week. That God's presence is provision for Israel, but it's also a shaking of the nations.
Yes. I listened to one commentator. It just said like he's rattling the nations until all their change.
I was picturing a bully holding a kid's leg is upside down and shaking him. I was like, that's probably not a great way to view God. I don't think that's what he's saying here. But
what's interesting too, I will shake the nations so that the treasures of all the nations shall come in. The treasures could also be translated like precious things. Which is exactly what the nation stole from Israel when they robbed the temple and burned it down. They took all of the precious things out of God's temple.
That's another interesting thing is like, who cares how beautiful the house is?
We don't have all of our treasure back.
All the treasure that we had in it that made it special is gone. He's like, don't worry about it. I'm going to shake it out.
Right.
Okay, cool.
So this one's primarily addressed to Joshua, but everybody's included in this one. So just keep in mind, this new Joshua will be part of this new conquest like his old predecessor will, where the nations will be shaken, all the treasure that was stolen will be returned, God's presence will fall once again, and the land will be at peace. Okay. That's a big promise.
It's a big promise.
So let's jump forward to the final oracle number 5.
Final oracle.
And this one's directed specifically to Zerubbabel, the grandson of Jehoiakim, the descendant of David, Jehoiakim being the last king of Israel.
Okay.
Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I'm about to shake the heavens and the earth. Same thing.
Okay.
And to overthrow the throne of kingdoms.
The throne, singular, of kingdoms, plural?
That's
a weird one.
I did not pick that up when I read it, actually. That is odd.
I mean, just a stab in the dark. You did mention that there was a ruler over all the other people named the snake earlier.
Yes.
I'm just like, I mean,
maybe.
There's the prince of the power of the air.
There's a more metaphysical power being
anyway.
implied here. Anyway.
There's probably something.
And I'm about to destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations and overthrow the chariots and their riders, and the horses and the riders shall all go down, everyone by the sword of his brother. Which is interesting because on this day when God shakes the earth and the heavens, the battle will happen by friendly fire on the other side.
Yeah.
Which is a way that God gives Israel victory throughout its history.
Yep.
Enemies just start fighting each other, and Israel walks out of their tents, and I guess the land is ours now. Yeah. And on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, and make you like a signet ring. I will give you that royal authority back. I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts.
His granddad's ring is coming back.
Yes. And I think this is what I kept thinking of was, why does Zerubbabel need this encouragement? I just kept thinking of that scene in Lord of the Rings where Aragorn goes to the blades of Narsil.
Oh, right. The blade that cut the ring off Sauron's hand and then was shattered into pieces.
Right. And then his grandfather or his forefather picks up the ring and has the opportunity to throw it into the fire of Mount Doom.
And destroy it forever.
But he doesn't.
Right.
And then as he's looking at this, he's also trying to remember his call to be a king. He's remembering the fact that he's a leader of a kingdom. Yeah. But he hasn't taken up that mantle yet.
Numenor.
Yeah, and then he says, the blood of Isildur still runs in my veins.
Oh, right. The blood of Jehoiakim still runs in the veins of Zerubbabel. Am I going to commit the sins of my grandfather?
Right,
and be cast out too?
I was just I don't have that information here.
Right.
But I was like, I could totally see why this would be an encouraging prophecy. I'm going to give to you, or why it'd be a terrifying prophecy. I'm going to give to you what was taken from your grandfather. But his blood still runs in my veins.
Right.
Anyway, I was just... a little bit of Lord of the Rings in my mind.
Hey, anything for an LTR, you know, anything.
So,
but the covenant is going to be restored when God shakes the nations and puts the ring of authority back on Israel's finger.
And what's fascinating here is that you have the shaking of the nations, that promise given to a priest, and that promise given to a king as well.
Yeah.
Normally, the shaking of the nations and the destruction of enemies is the purview of a king.
Yep.
But we have the shaking of the nations and the plunder of those nations going to the temple to rebuilding it, right?
Yes.
What I think this means is that Haggai wanted us to see that when God's kingdom comes fully and finally, Joshua's hopes for a restored temple and Zerubbabel's hopes for a restored kingdom would be combined in a single shaking of the earth.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
If you read the book of Zechariah,
Yep.
the figures of Joshua and Zerubbabel are mentioned again, and they're combined into one again.
Yep, that's right.
So as the prophetic literature unfolds, it almost seems like the prophets are looking forward into the future and seeing Joshua and Zerubbabel as two people, two figures that become one in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
Anyway,
It's like you've always had this dichotomy, and you've always had failure. So you had Moses and you had Aaron. You had a king and a priest, and they failed, right? You had David and he had priests, and it failed, right? You always had the king on the throne and the priest in the temple, and for some reason those two things just never really got off the ground.
And some people even say the reason we even have prophetic literature at all is because of the failure of God's priests to faithfully teach the covenant in the first place.
Right.
So you have Joshua here being given all the authority and hopes and expectations of somebody like Aaron would have been all the way back in the day. Almost as if Haggai's prophesied the end of his own ministry because we have a new Joshua. We have a new high priest who can do what he's supposed to do.
Yeah. There's this where a role that was separate, a king on the throne and a priest in the temple, and that's always failed historically.
Yeah.
There's going to be a conflagration of those two things.
On a single shaking, on a single day of shaking.
It's going to be surrounded by or consummated by a single day of shaking and a new ring of the covenant.
Yeah. There's
and an adornment of the temple and the presence of God.
Yeah.
The destruction of enemies.
Yeah. Maybe another way to say it, there's a day of shaking in the future coming where a new Joshua will reside over a temple more glorious than any that has come before.
Yes.
And a new royal authority will be given to a son of David to rule a kingdom of peace.
Okay.
That's what happens in the next. That's what Haggai says will happen when all these dominoes lined up.
Okay.
Zerubbabel and Joshua represent a final temple.
Yeah.
And a final Davidic king and a final peace for God's people.
And that's how the book of Haggai ends.
That's how the book of Haggai ends.
Right there.
I'll give you this ring.
All right. So how does all of this get us to Jesus? Because we talked about, I think it's interesting, we talked about, this delegation from Persia coming down, and there's the priest, and there's the king, and they have the materials for the tabernacle, and there's been this commission from an old king that they've been freed from, like the Exodus story, and everything is there for, the rule and covenant of God to come back again. And I just feel like that is how we're poised at the end of Haggai, leaning into the New Testament. It's like,
that's right,
man, all the pieces are here. This is like a priest who's a king, who's the temple, who brings God's presence. I mean,
yeah. And I think the reason we need to lean forward in the New Testament is because of this unanswered question in my head. It's like, so did Zerubbabel and Joshua do it? Were they the people? Because Haggai doesn't qualify it the way that we've been qualifying it. Haggai just says Joshua will experience this. Zerubbabel will experience this.
Yep.
But history tells us that they didn't.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
The temple was rebuilt.
Yep.
But sooner or later, Persia got overtaken by Greece, and Greece got taken over by Rome. And that's when Jesus shows up.
Right.
So, the hopes invested, the royal authority given to Zerubbabel, the hope of a glorious temple given to Joshua, don't pan out within their lifetimes.
Right.
Right?
And what's interesting, you have an interesting, ironic reversal of the promise where you had a gorgeous temple in the Herodian temple.
When Jesus would have been alive.
When Jesus was alive. But it came maybe from some of the pockets of Rome, but also from the heavy taxation on the people of God themselves.
That's right.
And so whose pockets are getting overturned and shaken out? Is it the conquest of the nations? Not really.
Right.
It's God's own people are getting shaken down
by their own corrupt rulers.
So it's like, man, this is not what we thought this would look like.
Yes.
And so Jesus hits the scene.
Right.
And where do we need to go here?
I mean, I think a really basic thing, which the Bible's already primed us to see, is to understand that Jesus is a new Joshua.
Right.
So we had a Joshua who was strong and courageous, who conquered a land. We have a Joshua who was in Haggai, who was promised the restoration of a more glorious temple.
And we have a Joshua in
Jesus.
Yeah. It's the same name.
It's the same name, just different pronunciations for some reason. Yeah. I don't know why. Do you know why people stopped
saying Joshua? I like because Yeshua,
right,
is the name, and
right.
I don't know why.
It's like, why do we start saying Jesus rather than Joshua?
I mean,
anyway,
it's a weird one.
So we have just another man named Joshua,
right,
who comes on the scene, right?
Yeah.
And we also know that he is a son of David,
right,
an heir of David,
a new Zerubbabel, who's named Joshua.
Right.
That's weird. Yeah.
Right. Are the promises of Haggai being fulfilled in one person?
Right.
Is Jesus going to be the one to shake the nations? Is he going to be the one to restore the temple to its former glory?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what happens then when Jesus comes to the temple?
He does a shaking?
He does a shaking.
Okay. Yeah.
Because the temple has not the place of worship of God anymore. It's become something other than that. It's been the place of fleecing the people. It's become a symbol of corrupt leadership, right?
Yeah. And so you have this like Mount Sinai moment where God comes down again,
right?
And it's a shaking.
And so he's shaking the kings of the leaders of Israel, the King Herod and the kings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the leaders of Israel.
Yep.
He comes and shakes this nation, and he does that first by whipping people and kicking people out of the temple and turning over tables. He literally shakes tables and disrupts worship in that place. And then he prophesies and says, not one stone will be left on top of this thing. And then he makes an odd prophecy about, in 3 days, I will raise a new temple back up again.
Right.
That's what happens when Jesus comes to the temple of Israel.
Yeah. So all this time, Israel has been looking for a new leader, a new king, to facilitate a new covenant with God again, and that would take place inside a new temple that outshone the glory of the former one.
Yeah.
And Jesus is doing that somehow by tearing down the very temple that Zerubbabel and Haggai were tasked to build.
Yeah, maybe it's helpful to go back to our previous podcast in Haggai and remember that when the priest and God's people first came back to the nation, they built just an altar. And it was this altar that kind of symbolized just religious performance,
right?
Doing in their own effort what they presumed was what God wanted, but failed to have the right relationship with God, right?
Religion without relationship,
Yeah. Haggai critiqued that and taught God's people and God's priest how to have a right relationship with the covenant and with his presence and with the temple.
Yeah.
The other hope is that leaders of God's people, Joshua, Zerubbabel, would enshrine those values for future generations, right? But that doesn't happen.
Right.
Instead, God's people falls into the same pattern they did before, but this time they have more money. So the temple becomes just religious ritual again.
Yeah, there's more than an altar there, but that's really the only function.
But it serves to line the pockets of the corrupt leaders of Israel.
Right.
There's a new failure of leadership.
Yes.
Israel is in some ways better off than they were right after the exile, but in some ways worse. They're being preyed upon by the leaders they would hope to trust in a situation that looks most like what they hope for.
Right.
Right?
And so once again, God sends a leader to Israel to destroy the temple. And that's Jesus this time.
That's Jesus' time.
Yes.
And what he's going to do, he's going to say, okay, if you're going to continue to have the wrong relationship with this temple and continue to confuse the presence and existence of a temple with a real relationship with me, the God of the covenant, I'm going to tear it down.
Right.
No temple will exist anymore.
Right. Which would mean no hope.
Right. Unless the temple was going to look different than it did before. And what Jesus says is, that temple is me.
Right.
I am the representative of God's covenant.
Right.
You come to me, my crucified body and resurrected body. That's who you come to. That's the symbol of the repaired relationship with God. I am the symbol of God's covenant blessing for all the world. I am its new king.
Right. And
Yeah.
that's the other thing. So he's not only the temple where the covenant can be restored, right? He's also the king that we've been given that can actually be the delegation between us and God
That's right.
to restore the covenant.
That's right. But
what's amazing is that he's not an earthly king going to a heavenly king, making some kind of deal.
Mm-hmm.
He is God himself making a deal with God himself. How unbreakable is that covenant?
Right. Right. Yes.
And if Jesus is given that ring, it can never be taken off because that ring is now on God's own finger.
Yes.
That's amazing. That is the kind of unbreakable covenant because it's between God and God.
Right. I haven't thought about the way that the reason Jesus's covenant that he makes is better is because it's between a divine king and a divine king.
Right.
And then that has to be unbreakable.
Yes.
Or far more binding than any of the other ones, and based on better promises.
Yep.
Right. That's what Hebrews is.
I mean, there's other leaning into Hebrews there. Is he calls Jesus the priest, right? He's our new high priest like Joshua.
That's right.
But he's from the order of Melchizedek, which is an order without a beginning. It's an eternal, so he's an eternal king in the line of David, and he's an eternal priest in the line of Melchizedek, so he can eternally facilitate the covenant and intercede for the sins of God's people at the right hand of God from divinity to divinity forever and ever. Amen.
So cool.
That's pretty cool.
So let's go back to the shaking of the nations.
Shaking.
So what's interesting is I was scouring my New Testament for references of Jesus' resurrection or his death to be described as a shaking.
Yeah.
And I couldn't find any.
Okay.
But what I did find was in Matthew 24, when Jesus is predicting the destruction of the temple, he describes it like a shaking.
That's right.
The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall, the heavenly bodies will be shaken.
Yep.
And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven.
That's so interesting then. So the shaking that Haggai is prophesying is actually the destruction of the temple that they're about to build.
Yeah.
And so he's like, and so that means then that the wealth of kings is Jesus himself, in a sense, because he says, "I will do a shaking, the temple's destroyed, and then I will come. God will come and manifest himself." Well, who is there?
And God's glory will fall. And if that temple's built, who's left?
Right.
To replace that temple? Only Jesus.
Only Jesus. Yeah, and the people of God who build brick by brick with him in the new temple of God.
So that's the first time the shaking is described, when the temple's actually destroyed. And the second time is, and probably the most helpful time, is in the book of Hebrews, where it quotes directly from Haggai.
Oh, sweet.
So we've got a divine author explaining what this text means to us. And so here's what Hebrews says. Hebrews 12:25 through 29. "See that you do not refuse the God who speaks to you. For if the people in the old covenant, people from Mount Sinai, did not escape when they refused to listen to God, how shall we escape if he speaks from heaven in all royal authority right now?" I'm kind of paraphrasing.
Yeah.
"The one whose voice has shaken the earth. But now God has promised us, saying this, 'Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also heaven.'" That's Haggai 2:6, the one he made to Joshua. "Yet once more," the author of Hebrews says, indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken, which means everything that has been made, leaving only the things which cannot be shaken. Therefore, we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear.
Whoa.
So, really interesting take on what Haggai is saying.
Yeah.
Haggai imagined a day where all the nations would be shaken and God's glory comes into the temple. All the wealth of the nation rebuilds God's temple into this glorious, amazing thing, or all the chariots are destroyed because they're all fighting with each other. And what the author of Hebrews is saying is like, what that really is referring to is what God will do on the last day. Over the course of human history, he will shake and shake and shake and shake until there's a final shaking where only the things that are immovable will remain.
Yeah.
And what will be immovable? Only the things that are from God.
Right.
All God's gold.
Yeah.
All God's silver.
Yeah.
God's true temple, Jesus.
Right.
His true covenant people.
Yeah.
That's all that will be left on that day. No enemy nations, only peace.
Right. Because everything else will be shaken off.
Because everything else will be shaken off.
That's cool. So Jesus is inviting us into a kingdom where he is the king, and he's going to make us unshakable.
Yes.
So we're not the ones who shake the nations.
No. No, we are not. We are not.
Spoiler alert.
Sorry.
Sorry, youth conference that we teased at the end of last episode. It is Jesus is the shaker of the nations, and to not be shaken out of it, all you have to do is join his kingdom.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And I think there's something interesting, too, about the final world that God creates. The final thing that the final king creates can't be lost. Adam and Eve probably had a pretty perfect world, you would think.
Right.
But it was lost, which means it couldn't have been perfect.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
I mean, we're never told the garden's perfect.
Right.
We're just told it's great.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, but there was something in it that was shakeable.
Yes.
Yeah.
In it. But one day, there will be something better than the Garden of Eden.
Wow.
That will never be taken.
Yeah.
Will never be shaken. And that's when Jesus returns.
Bring that on.
Yeah, I want that.
Awesome. So that's what Haggai was looking forward to.
That's what Haggai was looking
and
forward
that's
to.
what Jesus accomplished as the priest king who shakes the nations.
Yeah, and that's weirdly what the destruction of the temple accomplished, like prefigures.
Yeah.
Like the shaking of the heavens is like explicitly tied to that moment of history. So when the physical temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, it prophesies the rebuilding of an unshakable kingdom.
Right. Yeah. That's good news. Well, that's Haggai.
That's Haggai.
2 long episodes on 1 short book.
You're welcome, world.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. This has been awesome, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Spoken Gospel Podcast. Spoken Gospel creates short films, devotionals, and podcasts like this one. Everything we make is free because of generous supporters like you. To see our resources, visit spokengospel.com or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening. See you next week.